Have you ever felt like your life derailed so suddenly that all you could do is pick up the pieces and start over? That's how I ended up in this sprawling suburban house, surrounded by perfectly trimmed lawns and the faint scent of pine trees in the air. My name is Alice Harper, 24, a design student trying to make sense of the chaos left behind after my parents' divorce. Moving in with my Uncle Marcus was supposed to be my fresh start, a place to regroup and rebuild. Marcus' house looked like something straight off Pinterest, a white picket fence, a wide front porch, and oversized windows framing the endless forest behind it. It was the kind of house that looked too perfect, like it had no room for someone as messy and unanchored as me. Marcus was everything I remembered, charming, warm, with that easy smile that could light up a room. His wife Vivian, on the other hand, was the kind of person who could silence a room just by walking into it. Meticulous, poised, and always with perfectly styled hair, she seemed to exist on an entirely different plane from people like me. "Alice, your room is upstairs, second door on the left. Unpack your things and come down." Marcus made his signature steak, Vivian said, her voice so neutral it could have been mistaken for indifference. To her, I wasn't family. I was an inconvenient houseguest staying a little too long. I climbed the creaky staircase, glancing at the family photos lining the walls. There was Marcus on the beach, Marcus with his buddies fishing, Marcus and Vivian smiling at a garden party. There wasn't a single picture where I could imagine myself fitting in. The room they gave me was spotless and impersonal. White walls, a neat bedspread, a single lamp on a plain nightstand. It felt more like a guest room in a model home than a place where I could truly live. Unpacking my things took an hour, but I was deliberately slow, dragging it out so I wouldn't have to go downstairs. Eventually, I sighed, adjusted my shirt, and headed toward the kitchen. Marcus was at the table, enthusiastically recounting some story to Vivian, who nodded mechanically, her attention clearly elsewhere. Neither of them noticed me at first. Only when I was close enough did Marcus turn, flashing that familiar, welcoming grin. "Alice, sit down. You must be starving," he said, gesturing to an empty chair. I sat and picked at the food, barely tasting it. Across the table, Vivian meticulously cut her steak, her movements so precise it was almost unnerving. She glanced at me occasionally with a look I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't warm either. After dinner, Marcus excused himself to the porch for a cigar, leaving me alone with Vivian. She placed her fork down, clasped her hands neatly, and finally spoke. "So, Alice, how do you like it here so far?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. "It's nice," I replied, though it was the last word I wanted to use. She nodded, but her piercing gaze remained fixed on me. "You think you can escape your problems here, don't you?" she said suddenly, her voice sharper than before. Her words hit me like a slap. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to respond. "No, I just want a fresh start." Vivian didn't say another word. She stood, gathered the plates, and walked into the kitchen. I stayed seated at the table, feeling the silence of the room press down on me like a weight. That night, something shifted. It wasn't just the house or my new reality. It was the eerie sense that things wouldn't stay as simple as they seemed. It started subtly, like the faintest whisper in the back of my mind. At first, I didn't even realize what it was. Just fleeting moments, tiny flickers of something I didn't dare name. The way Marcus would tilt his head slightly when he listened to me talk, or the warmth in his laugh when I said something that caught him off guard. It wasn't unusual, not at first. But over time, those moments began to linger in my mind longer than they should have. I'd catch myself watching him. The way his hands moved when he worked on something strong and deliberate, or how he absent-mindedly ran his fingers through his dark, slightly graying hair. He carried himself with an effortless confidence, and it was magnetic. Sometimes I'd feel his gaze on me too. Quick, fleeting glances that I convinced myself were nothing but curiosity. Yet somehow they felt like more. One afternoon, a week after I'd moved in, Marcus was outside fixing the garden gate. I stood in the kitchen, absently wiping the counter, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. There he was, shirt damp with sweat, the sun catching the edge of his jawline as he worked. I should have looked away. I should have gone back to my own business. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed there, watching as he wiped his brow, his movements slow and deliberate. At one point, he glanced back toward the house, catching me staring. My breath caught, and I quickly ducked my head, pretending to focus on something else. When I dared to look again, he was smiling. A small, knowing smile. My face burned with embarrassment. "Alice," he called through the open kitchen door. "Could you hand me the wrench from the shed? I can't seem to find it." I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, just a second." I found the wrench and stepped outside, the late afternoon air thick and warm. Marcus was crouched by the gate, tightening a bolt. When I approached, he straightened, towering over me as he took the wrench from my hand. "Thanks," he said, his voice light but soft in a way that made me shiver. "No problem," I murmured, trying to sound casual. But the moment felt too close, too charged. I watched as he went back to work, trying to convince myself that this was all in my head. But it wasn't. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he made me feel seen, that I couldn't ignore. I hadn't felt this kind of attention in years, not since high school, maybe not ever. That night, as I lay in bed, the memory of him lingered. The warmth of his voice, the way his fingers gripped the wrench, the small smile that had flickered across his face. It shouldn't have meant anything, and yet it did. The confusion gnawed at me. How could I feel this way? Marcus was my uncle, not by blood, but still family. He was kind, generous, and exactly what I needed in this chaotic chapter of my life. And yet, the thought of him, the way he moved, the way he looked at me, kept circling back, gripping me like a quiet storm I couldn't escape. The next morning, things only got worse. Marcus was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, dressed in his usual jeans and a button-up shirt. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the room. "Morning," he said, his tone warm and familiar. "Morning," I replied, avoiding his eyes as I grabbed a mug for myself. As I reached for the coffee pot, our hands brushed, just for a moment. My pulse quickened, and I pulled back too quickly, nearly knocking over my mug in the process. "You okay?" Marcus asked, his brow furrowed in concern. "Yeah," I said too quickly. "Just a little clumsy today." He smiled again, but this time it felt different. Softer. Almost curious. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, sorting through my sketchbook, organizing my closet, anything to keep my mind from wandering. But no matter what I did, the image of him lingered. His smile, his voice, the quiet magnetism that seemed to draw me closer even when I wanted to pull away. It wasn't just attraction, it was a quiet, unspoken pull, and it terrified me. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. The house was unusually quiet. Vivian had left early in the morning to meet friends for brunch, and Marcus had disappeared upstairs after breakfast. I assumed he was working on something or reading, as he often did when the house fell into a lull. I was looking for a book I'd borrowed and forgotten to return. I knew Marcus kept some of his things in the spare room next to his bedroom, so I wandered upstairs, my bare feet making soft sounds on the wooden floor. The door to his room was slightly ajar, the faint sound of his breathing coming through the crack. Without thinking, I pushed the door open. The air inside felt still, heavy with an unspoken energy. And there he was, Marcus, stretched out on the bed, one arm thrown over his face, his shirt unbuttoned halfway, exposing the tan skin of his chest. He was asleep, his breath slow and steady, the rise and fall of his chest oddly mesmerizing. I should have left. I should have turned around and pretended I hadn't just invaded his space. But I didn't. Instead, I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest. "Alice." His voice broke the silence, groggy and low, as if you were caught somewhere between sleep and wakefulness. His arm shifted, and he blinked up at me, his dark eyes heavy-lidded and soft. I'm sorry, I stammered, stepping back. I didn't mean to. I was just looking for her. It's okay, he interrupted, sitting up slowly. The blanket slipped down his torso, and I felt my face flush. You're fine. I stayed rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do. Marcus rubbed his face with one hand, then looked at me, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Looking for something? He asked, his voice still thick with sleep. Yeah. The book I borrowed last week. I thought it might be in the spare room, I said, tripping over my words. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer than it should have. I think I saw it in the living room last night, he said. You might want to check there.
Right.
I'll go look, I said quickly, but I didn't move. The air between us felt charged, as if something unsaid was hanging there, waiting to be acknowledged. You don't have to rush off, Marcus said softly, leaning back against the headboard. His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. I hesitated, then stepped further into the room, the door creaking slightly as I pushed it open wider. I didn't mean to wake you, I said, my voice quieter now.
You didn't, he replied.
I wasn't really asleep. The tension in the room was palpable, and I found myself sitting on the edge of a chair near his desk, as if some invisible force had pulled me closer. Marcus watched me, his gaze steady but unreadable. Are you settling in okay? He asked after a moment, his voice gentle. I nodded.
Yeah.
It's just a lot to get used to, I guess. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. You know you can talk to me, right? If there's anything on your mind. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and before I could stop myself, the words spilled out. It's just hard. Starting over. Feeling like I don't belong anywhere. Marcus' expression softened, and he tilted his head slightly, as if seeing me in a new light. You belong here, Alice, he said firmly. Don't ever think otherwise. His words sent a shiver through me, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. There was something in the way he said it, so certain, so unyielding, that made my chest tighten. Thanks, I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat in silence for a moment, the room filled with nothing but the sound of our breathing. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was something else entirely. You're stronger than you think, Marcus said finally, his voice low. I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't feel strong, I admitted. His eyes locked onto mine, and there was something in his gaze that made my stomach flip. You are, he said simply. Time seemed to stretch, the space between us shrinking without either of us moving. I didn't know what I was feeling. Confusion, guilt, a strange, electric pull that left me breathless. I should go, I said suddenly, standing too quickly. Marcus nodded, but his eyes didn't leave mine. Of course, he said softly. As I turned to leave, I felt his gaze follow me, burning into my back like a physical touch. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized that something had shifted between us. Something I couldn't take back. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It was in the little things, the subtle shifts that started to weave themselves into the fabric of our days. Like how Marcus would pause whenever I entered the room, his gaze lingering just a second longer than necessary. Or how our conversations grew quieter, more personal, as if the world outside the house didn't exist. It was late one evening, when the first line was crossed. Vivian had left to visit her sister for the weekend, and the house felt emptier than usual. Marcus and I sat on the porch, the summer air warm and thick, the sounds of crickets filling the silence between us. He was nursing a glass of bourbon, and I was curled up with a cup of tea, staring out at the dark silhouette of the forest. I'm glad you're here, Marcus said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. I turned to look at him, startled by the sincerity in his tone. You are? He nodded, his gaze fixed on the glass in his hand. This house can feel empty sometimes. You make it feel alive again." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt the weight of them settle in my chest. "I don't know if I've ever felt like I belong anywhere," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked at me then, his eyes darker than usual, something unspoken flickering in their depths. "You belong here," he said softly. The air between us felt charged, and I looked away, afraid that if I met his gaze for too long, I'd get lost in it. I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to ground myself, but when I felt his hand rest gently on my shoulder, I froze. "It's okay," he said quietly, his touch lingering. I didn't move. I couldn't. Instead, I let myself lean into the warmth of his hand, the weight of his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. And then, before I could stop myself, I turned and wrapped my arms around him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even conscious. It was instinct, an ache I couldn't contain anymore. Marcus stiffened for a moment, then his arms came around me, holding me tightly. "It's okay," he murmured again, his voice close to my ear. But it wasn't okay. Not really. And yet, I didn't pull away. The first kiss came the following night. We had been watching a movie in the living room, a light-hearted comedy that neither of us was paying attention to. The space between us on the couch had shrunk over the course of the evening, until we were sitting close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. All I know is that one moment, we were laughing at something inconsequential, and the next his hand was brushing against mine. I turned to look at him, and the laughter faded from both of our faces. His eyes searched mine, as if he were looking for permission, and for a split second, I thought I'd pull away. But I didn't. When his lips touched mine, it was gentle, hesitant, like he was afraid I might disappear if he moved too fast. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure he could hear it, and yet I didn't stop him. I couldn't. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was no past, no future, only the warmth of his lips and the steady press of his hand on the small of my back. When we finally pulled apart, the silence that followed was deafening. "We shouldn't have done that," Marcus said quietly, his voice heavy with guilt. "I know," I whispered, my throat tight, but neither of us moved. "This is complicated," he said after a moment, his hand still resting on my arm. "Dangerous," I added, my voice trembling. His gaze met mine, and for the first time, I saw the conflict there, the push and pull of emotions he was trying so hard to contain. "I don't want to hurt you, Alice," he said softly. "You're not," I replied, though I wasn't sure if that was true. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on both of us, and yet, as I sat there, staring into his eyes, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. We didn't speak after that. The silence stretched between us as I got up and left the room, my heart still racing. As I closed the door to my bedroom, I leaned against it, my head spinning. I knew we had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And yet, part of me didn't want to go back. Vivian had always been sharp. It wasn't just her immaculate appearance or the way she seemed to glide through life without a hair out of place. It was her ability to notice things. Small details others would overlook, slight changes in tone, the tiniest shifts in behavior. And now it was as if she could see right through us. I didn't realize how obvious it had become until one morning at breakfast. Marcus sat across the table, barely touching his coffee. His usual easy smile was absent, replaced by a quiet tension that clung to him like a second skin. I tried to keep my focus on my plate, but I could feel his gaze flicker toward me, cautious, careful. Too careful. Vivian's eyes darted between us, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around her mug. She didn't say anything, but her silence was louder than words. "You're awfully quiet this morning, Marcus," she said finally, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. He looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Just tired," he replied, his tone too casual. Didn't sleep well. Vivian's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before shifting to me. And you, Alice? How are you finding things? Her question felt loaded, like it carried a weight I wasn't prepared to lift. Fine, I said quickly, forcing a smile. It's been nice here. Her lips curved into a tight smile, but her eyes were calculating. Good, she said softly, almost to herself. The tension only grew from there. Vivian began watching us more closely, her presence in the house suddenly feeling omnipresent. She lingered in rooms longer than necessary, her eyes following every movement, every word exchanged. And then came the moment when it all unraveled. It was a late afternoon and Marcus and I were in the study. He had been helping me with a design project I'd been working on, an excuse, really, to spend time together without arousing suspicion. The sun streamed through the windows, casting golden light across the room. I was seated at the desk, Marcus standing behind me, leaning over to look at my sketches. You're talented, Alice, he said, his voice low. Really talented. I turned to look at him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. You really think so? He nodded, his eyes meeting mine.
Ida.
The moment stretched between us, and before I knew it, his hand was on my shoulder, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin. My breath hitched, and I felt that familiar pull, the one I'd been trying so hard to resist. Marcus, I whispered, but whatever I was about to say was lost when the door swung open. Vivian stood in the doorway, her expression frozen. Her eyes flicked between us, landing on Marcus's hand, still resting on my shoulder. The color drained from her face, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the air conditioner. What's going on here? She asked, her voice dangerously calm. Marcus pulled his hand away as if burned, stepping back. Vivian, it's not what it looks like. Not what it looks like? She repeated, her voice rising. Then explain to me what exactly it is. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Vivian, let's talk about this privately, Marcus said, his tone firm but pleading. She turned to him, her eyes flashing with anger and something else, hurt.
No, Marcus.
We'll talk about it right here. With her. She spat the last word like it was poison. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around us. I could feel the weight of her stare, the judgment, the betrayal. It's not her fault, Marcus said, stepping between us. This is on me. Vivian let out a bitter laugh. Oh, so you're protecting her now? How noble. She turned to me, her voice sharp. What exactly are you doing here, Alice? Because it's clearly not just living under our roof. I stammered, but she didn't let me finish.
Save it, she snapped.
I don't want to hear whatever excuse you're about to come up with. The air felt heavy with everything unsaid, with the weight of a secret that was no longer a secret. Vivian's face hardened, and she looked at Marcus, her voice cold. I hope you're happy with the mess you've created. With that, she turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind her. Marcus let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. Alice, I'm so sorry, he said, his voice filled with regret. I shook my head, unable to speak. The knot in my chest tightened until it was almost unbearable. It's over, I said finally, my voice breaking. She knows. I'll handle it, Marcus said, though his words sounded hollow. But we both knew the truth. There was no handling this. The secret had unraveled, and the damage was done. The house was unbearably quiet after Vivian's outburst. She had stormed out that evening, slamming the front door so hard it echoed through the halls. Marcus tried to go after her, but she didn't let him. Don't, she had said, her voice cold, her eyes shimmering with restrained tears. There's nothing left to say. I sat on my bed, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the faint lines of light coming through the blinds. My hands trembled as I replayed everything over and over again. The look on Vivian's face, the hurt in her voice, and Marcus standing there, caught between us like a man with no escape. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I had tried to convince myself that what Marcus and I shared was harmless, that it was fleeting and private, something that existed in a separate world where consequences didn't matter. But now, the weight of reality was crashing down on me. The guilt was overwhelming, a heavy knot in my chest that tightened with every passing moment. Vivian had trusted me, let me into her home, and I had betrayed her in the worst way possible. Worse still, I had dragged Marcus down with me. But even as the guilt consumed me, there was another feeling, something darker, something I hated myself for. I missed him, the warmth of his presence, the way he looked at me like I was the only person who mattered. It was intoxicating, and no amount of logic or morality could quiet the ache I felt for him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered downstairs, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a weight. The living room was dark, but I could see the faint glow of light from Marcus's study. I hesitated for a moment, then walked toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. He was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. He looked up when I entered, and the exhaustion on his face was impossible to miss. "Alice," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry," I blurted out, the words tumbling from my lips before I could stop them. "I'm so sorry for everything." Marcus stood, closing the distance between us in a few quick steps. "This isn't your fault," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I should have stopped it. I should have been stronger." I shook my head, tears spilling down my cheeks.
No, Marcus.
I knew it was wrong. I knew, and I still wanted. He pulled me into his arms, cutting off my words. I froze for a moment, then melted into him, the familiar warmth of his embrace both comforting and torturous. "We have to stop this," I whispered against his chest, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his tone filled with a sorrow that mirrored my own. "But it's not that simple, is it?" We stood there for what felt like an eternity, clinging to each other like we were drowning, and the other was the only thing keeping us afloat. But the weight of the moment was too much. I pulled back, wiping at my tears as I stepped away. "Vivian doesn't deserve this," I said, my voice cracking. "She doesn't deserve to be hurt like this. And you don't deserve to ruin everything you've built because of me." Marcus looked at me, his expression pained. "You think this is just about you?" "Alice, He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair as he turned away. "It's not that simple," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "It has to be," I said firmly, though my resolve was already crumbling. I left the study before he could say anything else, retreating to my room where I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and longing. Over the next few days, the tension in the house became unbearable. Vivian had moved into the guest room, her presence cold and distant. Marcus and I avoided each other as much as possible, but every stolen glance, every accidental brush of hands, reignited the spark that refused to die. The guilt was suffocating, but so was the emptiness I felt without him. I knew we couldn't continue down this path. It was tearing all of us apart. But the thought of letting him go felt like ripping out a piece of myself. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, I found myself standing by the lake at the edge of the property. The water was calm, reflecting the fiery hues of the sky. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath as I tried to find clarity in the stillness. I didn't hear Marcus approach, but I felt his presence before he spoke. "Alice," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. I turned to face him, my heart aching at the sight of him. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied, his gaze steady, "but I don't know how to stop." The raw honesty in his voice broke something inside me, and for a moment, I wanted to give in, to forget the world and everything that made this wrong. But I couldn't. "We have to," I said, tears welling in my eyes. For Vivian. For us. For everything we're destroying. Marcus stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. Alice, Don't, I said, pulling away. Please don't. The pain in his eyes was unbearable, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. I need to figure out who I am without this. Without you, I said, my voice trembling. The words felt like a dagger to my own heart, but I knew they were true. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight, and for the first time, he looked truly broken. If that's what you need, he said softly, his voice heavy with resignation. I turned and walked away, the sound of my footsteps on the gravel, the only thing breaking the silence. But as I reached the house, I glanced back, and there he was, standing by the water, his silhouette bathed in the last light of the setting sun. And for the first time, I wondered if walking away would ever truly set me free. The decision to leave wasn't one I made lightly. It clung to me for days, weighing on every breath, every step I took through the house. Vivian barely spoke to me now. Her presence was like a cold draft that seeped into every corner, unspoken accusations hanging in the air. And Marcus was doing everything he could to repair the cracks we'd caused, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. The tension in his shoulders, the dark circles under his eyes. He was trying to hold the family together, but the pieces no longer fit the way they used to. I knew I couldn't stay. It was early morning when I packed my bags. The house was still and quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavier than it should. My suitcase sat on the edge of the bed as I folded clothes and tucked them away. Each item felt like a goodbye, one more thread of connection I was cutting loose. I heard a knock at the door and froze. "Come in," I said softly, my voice barely carrying across the room. The door creaked open, and Marcus stepped inside. He looked at the suitcase, then at me, his face unreadable. "So, it's final," he said, his voice quiet but steady. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I think it's the only way, Marcus. Staying here, it's not helping anyone. Not you, not Vivian. And definitely not me." He crossed the room and leaned against the wall, his arms folded across his chest. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I never wanted it to come to this," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "Neither did I replied, my throat tightening. He looked at me then, his dark eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name, something between sadness and acceptance. "You don't have to go, Alice. We can figure this out." I shook my head, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. "Marcus, we can't. Look around. Everything's falling apart because of us. Staying would just make it worse." His jaw tightened, and he pushed off the wall, taking a step closer. "You know this isn't easy for me, right? Letting you go. Do you think it's easy for me?" I shot back, my voice breaking. This connection we have, it's like a storm, Marcus. It tears through everything in its path. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep hurting everyone around us." His hand reached out, brushing against mine, and for a fleeting moment, I let myself feel it, the warmth, the comfort, the pull I'd been fighting for so long. But I pulled away. "I'm leaving for you, Marcus," I said softly. "For you and Vivian. You need to fix things with her. She deserves that much. And I need to find a way to fix myself." He didn't argue. Maybe he knew there was no point, or maybe he was just as exhausted as I was. "I'll drive you to the station," he said, his voice resigned. "No," I replied quickly. "I need to do this alone." We stood there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said. "But promise me one thing." I looked at him, waiting. "Promise me you'll take care of yourself," he said, his voice raw. "No matter what." I swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I promise." A few hours later, I stood on the front porch, my suitcase at my side. The sky was gray, the air heavy with the threat of rain. Vivian was nowhere to be seen, but I didn't expect her to come out and say goodbye. Marcus stood in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. He didn't say anything, but his eyes said enough. "Goodbye, Marcus," I said, my voice trembling. "Goodbye, Alice," he replied, his words barely audible. And then I walked away. The drive to the station was a blur, the scenery passing by in a haze of green and gray. When I finally boarded the train, I found a seat by the window and stared out as the world rolled by. The house, Marcus, everything I was leaving behind, it all felt like a dream, something distant and unreal. But the weight in my chest reminded me it wasn't. As the train pulled away, I thought about what came next. I didn't have the answers, not yet. All I knew was that I couldn't let this define me. I had to find a way to rebuild, to move forward. The ache for Marcus lingered, a quiet hum in the back of my mind. I knew it would for a long time. But some things, no matter how much you want them, aren't meant to be. The world outside blurred as the rain began to fall, and for the first time in weeks, I let the tears come. It wasn't closure, not really. But it was a beginning. And sometimes that's enough.